Okay, last time we were talking about the historicity of the Bible, and we began way back at the beginning of the history of Israel and looked at the reliability of the Genesis text, its description of what's called the patriarchal period, the period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph. Now we're going to look at the next big event, if you will, in biblical history, the history of Israel in slavery, in bondage in Egypt, and the event that is known almost universally as the Exodus. Let's first start just by reviewing what the Bible has to say about the Exodus account, and then we're going to examine the extra-biblical evidence. The period of the Exodus follows the death of Joseph. He's the last guy in that line of the patriarchs. The Hebrews are enslaved. They help build the two store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and then down the line we learn that Moses is born. Moses, after killing an Egyptian, flees Egypt. Later he is contacted by God. God reveals himself to him and asks him to come back and relieve the suffering of the Israelites and lead them out of bondage. And finally, after their 10 plagues have occurred, the Egyptian Pharaoh, having been confronted by Moses with God's demands, allows the Israelites to leave. And then after 40 years of wandering in the desert, they finally show up in the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Now, after the time of Joseph, the Israelites we're told in the Bible, settle in the land of Goshen, the eastern Nile Delta area there, northeastern Nile Delta. And they eventually turn up after their exodus in the land of Canaan. And they are described in the Bible as having entered through Moab from the east, crossing over the Jordan River for the period of biblical history that's often referred to as the conquest. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. Did these events really happen? According to the Bible, of course they did. It says here in Exodus 3 that, "So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing of milk and honey." And we learn later in Exodus 12, that at the end of 430 years of bondage, to the very day, all the hosts, all the people of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt, all the Israelites. Now, the skeptics have two views about this biblical account. One view is that there was no Exodus, and the nation of Israel did not ever exist in Egypt, that it really was a small tribal group that kind of just emerged out of the Canaanite tribes in the northern hill country of Canaan, about 900 or 1000 BC. And that's the view of the so-called biblical minimalists. Another view is that the Exodus happened, but it happens much later than the Bible indicates. According to the Bible's internal chronology, the chronological information provided, in particular in 1 Kings chapter 6, the Exodus took place exactly 480 years before Solomon commenced his building project of the temple in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Well, Solomon began his reign in 970 BC. 4 years later would be 966 BC. 480 years before that would be about 1446 BC. If you take the Bible's own internal chronology, you ought to expect an Exodus at about 1446. And many scholars think there was an Exodus, but they doubt that it happened then. What are the reasons for these skeptical views? Well, the stated reasons are, first, that there's a lack of Egyptian text describing the event of the Exodus. A second reason is that there's an absence of evidence for a strong Egyptian influence on Israelite culture, or Israelite, what archaeologists call material culture. The style of architecture, the kinds of weapons that are used, the pottery styles, all those kinds of things. The third reason for the skeptical view that's offered is that there's no material evidence of the 40 years of wandering in the Sinai, or wherever it was they wandered, and there are different theories about that as well. Okay, so those are the stated reasons. I would say there's another reason underlying a lot of the skepticism, though. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Yeah, Parker?
Second, they undermine any historical aspect about the Bible. They undermine the historicity of the entire account. And once they do that, then it strengthens their argument that it's all a bunch of hooey.
If you hold a materialistic worldview, or a naturalistic worldview, think that matter and energy are all there really is, and there's nothing outside the material universe, there is a particular event in the Exodus that simply cannot have occurred. Maybe
the parting of
the Red Sea to start with, maybe the 10 plagues. I mean,
Right.
There is a series of miraculous occurrences that are recorded in the Exodus account. Here's a guy that shares that view. His name is Zev Herzog. He's at Tel Aviv University, and he puts it very strongly, okay? So here he goes. The Israelites were never in Egypt. They did not wander in the desert. They did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and they did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. The many Egyptian documents that we have make no mention of the Israelites or their presence in Egypt, and they are also silent about the events of the Exodus. Therefore, there was no Exodus. That's his conclusion, okay? So that's the minimalist view. Now, that's what we're going to take on today. The typical defenses of the historical reliability of the Bible from people who believe it have been, in my view, cogent, but they're essentially arguments from silence. Now, let me just run a few of them by you. First, the skepticism of the minimalists is based on the presupposition against the historicity of the Bible. I think it probably is true, but we're going to argue it a little differently today. Another objection, the Egyptians would not record embarrassing events. And I think there's a lot of cogency to this. We find that in monuments of ancient kings, there is a penchant for braggadocio. These guys just don't record the embarrassing stuff. They embellish on their triumphs, and they're strangely silent about other events that we know did happen that aren't so flattering. There's, by my count, at least 3 separate extra-biblical inscriptions mentioning Israel that tells us that they existed no more, that they were wiped out, okay? Which is, indicative of this penchant towards braggadocio. Another objection is that the Israelites would not have adopted or retained the Egyptian material culture. They had no reason to do that. They were a distinctive people group. They were being enslaved by these people. Why would they emulate them in that way? And finally, it's clearly the case that nomadic peoples do not leave material remains for a long time. The Bedouins, who have been a nomadic people group in the Middle East, we don't really even have evidence of their movements from the 19th century. All of these are, I think, reasonable defenses, but they're essentially arguments from silence. What we're going to do today is make an argument for the historicity of the Exodus account based on positive evidence. The basic case we're going to make is pretty straightforward. The nation of Israel was present in Egypt prior to 1446 in the capacity as slaves of the Egyptian empire. Secondly, we're going to see that there's evidence that the Israelites entered Canaan after 1400 BC, established themselves as the dominant nation in the area, and we're going to see both this time, but especially next time, that there is destruction evidence that matches the accounts in the books of Joshua and Judges that suggests that it was the Israelites who were the ones doing the conquering in this period of time. And thirdly, at the very end, we're going to see a really interesting new inscription that suggests that not only did the Israelites move from point A to point B, from Egypt to Canaan, there's also evidence of the wandering along the way. And so there was an exodus. And that's what we're going to establish today. Okay, let's look first at the evidence for the presence of Israel in Egypt. Now, we need to introduce a little subtlety into our analysis of the evidence. There were 3 different people designations that we got to keep our eye on. There are Asiatics, which is the Egyptian way of referring to anyone to the east in that area of Canaan. And that's going to include a lot of people groups. It's going to include the Israelites. It's going to include a larger group of Semites. Canaanites, for example, are Semites but not Israelites. And it's going to include some other tribes like Hurrians, who are Asiatic but not Semite nor Israelite. So you've got, think of it as 3 big concentric circles. The biggest circle has the largest group of peoples. The second circle, the Semites, is a little smaller group of peoples. And then you have the Israelites as one tribe within those 2 larger circles. Now, that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because when the Egyptians are referring to the Asiatics, they could be referring to a particular group of Asiatics, or they could be referring to the larger group. So we don't always know. And so any mention or evidence of Asiatics in Egypt could be evidence for the Israelites, because they are one of the people groups who are Asiatics, but it might not be, okay? But what we're going to see is that many mentions of Asiatics in Egypt, whether they are definitely evidences of Israelites or just possibly evidence of Israelites, these other mentions will also confirm other aspects of the biblical account. For example, we're going to see that there is a lot of extra biblical evidence that the Egyptians were involved in large public building projects involving the forced labor of Asiatic slaves, okay? And that's the picture we get from the biblical text as well. Okay, let's just look at some of these evidences. We've got our map again. We're going to look at a place called Tel El Daba, which is right in Goshen, right where we know from the Bible that the descendants of Joseph settled. So this is where we would expect to find Israelites. And there in Tel al-Daba, we do find evidence of at least Asiatic material culture. We have a style of architecture from northern Canaan that's found commonly throughout the Nile Delta there. We have a large Asiatic statue that's been discovered, or a statue of an Asiatic person. We have tombs containing Asiatic weapons, including that cool dagger at the bottom of the slide there. We've got Middle Bronze Canaanite pottery, Asiatic and also Semitic. And we've got ceremonial artifacts that are in Asiatic form. In addition, we've got textual evidence of Asiatics. This is a wall painting showing the Asiatic traders coming from Canaan into Egypt with their animals. This confirms an aspect of the biblical account. We know all the way back to Abraham, but also in the time of Joseph, that there were established trade routes between Egypt and Canaan. Here's a biblical text that describes it, talking about the Israelites. They took their livestock and their property, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and came to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him. So these were known and established trade routes between Canaan and Egypt, okay? We also have Egyptian textual evidence of Asiatics. This is a fascinating one. It's on a monument called Spios Artemides, and it's a description that attests that there were Asiatics living in the Nile Delta in Avaris, along with vagrants. That was an Egyptian term for sheep herders, and they were not worshiping the Egyptian sun god Ra, okay? So we have a reference to Asiatics who also are conducting their lives in ways that are distinctive of the Israelites. They didn't worship the Egyptian sun god Ra, we know that, but we also know that the Israelites were sheep herders. In fact, when Joseph was making his case to Pharaoh to allow him and his descendants to settle in Goshen, he basically said, look, you guys have never been sheep herders. Goshen's a great place for raising sheep, so let us have this land. And Pharaoh acceded to that request. This could very well be a reference to the Israelites. It's a nice match. There's a specificity there. More Egyptian textual evidence of Asiatics. 18th century dynasty in Leningrad, it records the building of public projects by slaves, some Asiatics and some Semitic. And we know from the Bible, again, that exactly these kinds of projects were going on. Exodus 1:11 said the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. So we get a convergence in the two accounts of the conditions, the practices of the Egyptians, and the way they enslaved people from the region of the East. This is a famous wall mural, the tomb of Rekhmire. There's an inscription with it that says, "The rod is in my hand, be not idle." And you see the Egyptian slave master with clearly the distinction between himself and the slaves there. The wall mural here clearly portrays people of Semitic features. We have, in addition, inscriptions with Semitic language in Egypt dating from 1500 BC. So lots of evidence of Semites. We also know that the Semites that are described in Egyptian records held positions that range from a very lowly slave to a powerful chancellor. And that's, again, a match with what we know about the Israelites. They were slaves, but some of them, in particular Joseph and maybe some of his immediate descendants, were high-ranking people in the Egyptian society. Okay, but let's move on now to some things that are getting a little more specific. Let's get to that smallest concentric circle. In 1966, there was an excavation begun in the area of Goshen. The archaeologist who was in charge of it was an Austrian named Manfred Bietek. And he found a distinctive style of architecture there that is a four-room house, and he immediately identified it as distinctively Israelite. Turns out that this style of architecture is the most common style of architecture throughout the entire Iron Age in Israel. From the time of King David, about 1000 BC, right up to the time of the Babylonian conquest in 587, the most common style of Israelite architecture is the four-room house. This distinctive style of four-room house that was discovered back in Egypt in Goshen. It's not an Egyptian style. It's not a generically Canaanite style. It's a specifically Israelite style. And I've got a little clip from a film called Exodus Revealed that describes a little bit more about what was discovered, and also you can see this distinctive style of architecture in the film.
Over the past 4 decades, extensive investigation has established the presence of ancient Israel in the Nile Delta. In 1966, just outside the small town of Cantir, an Austrian research team headed by Dr. Manfred Bietek made the first of a remarkable series of discoveries. Ruins at an excavation site called Tel El Daba are remains of what is now believed to be the earliest Israelite settlement in Egypt. While excavating in these cornfields, Manfred Bietek's team made another intriguing find. In a plot of land, later identified as Area F, they uncovered the ruins of a village.
In this small village there in stratum D2, dating to the time of Joseph, all the remains are Asiatic in nature. The material culture there is Asiatic, nothing is Egyptian.
A map of the excavation site confirms its distinctly Israelite origins. Archaeologists immediately recognized that the design of this horseshoe-shaped dwelling was identical to structures built in Israel centuries later. It was a prototype of Hebrew architecture constructed near the time Joseph was believed to have lived in Egypt.
Isn't that cool? What we're looking for is what I call specificity. You have a match, okay? When you have a really detailed description of something, and then you find it someplace else, you think, hey, maybe there's something going on here. So the archaeologists have found this particular style of architecture in Israel over hundreds of years. It is the mainstay of Israelite building projects. It's what the builders built for people's ordinary living. And this is the kind of style of architecture they found in Goshen. It's a way of establishing the presence of Israel in Egypt prior to the biblical date for the Exodus. Now there's something I think that's even more exciting, more specific, and that is the discovery of the fragmentary papyrus. It's a household record, an Egyptian household record from about 1740 BC. And in the record, there are lists of slave names. And many of them are Asiatic, many are Semitic, over 30 are Semitic, but many are distinctively Hebrew. Names like Menahem and Shipra, and feminine forms of the biblical name Issachar and Asher, and another name, Akab, which is either a variation on Jacob, or it may just be the name Jacob itself. So you have distinctive Hebrew names in the slave records of Egyptian households. Were the Israelites present in Egypt? It certainly appears that they were. So now we've established the first thing we wanted to establish, that the Israelites were in Egypt. We find distinctive material culture, the remains of the four-room house, distinctive Israelite architecture, as well as specifically Hebrew names in Egyptian household records, establishing the presence of Israel in Egypt prior to the biblical date for the Exodus. Now, to establish that there was an Exodus, we have to establish that somehow they got to Canaan. So what we want to look at now is evidence from a later period, after about 1400. There were 40 years of wandering in the desert. If the Exodus took place roughly about 1446, we should expect the entrance into Canaan to be right around 1400 BC, 1406 or thereabouts, okay? So it turns out, in a lot of the Canaanite records, we find that there is a transformation taking place, that the sedentary Canaanites are being conquered by new inhabitants. And there's a lot of extra-biblical evidence of this conquest taking place. One of those documents is a 14th century BC document called the Amarna Letters, and it refers to raids and to the conquest of several Canaanite cities by a people group called the Hapiru. The Hapiru. That raises the question, who were the Hapiru? The Hapiru is a term that was used for nomadic peoples throughout the Near East. Some scholars think that the name Hebrew is derivative of Hapiru. There's a guy named Frank Moracross who was involved in the Dead Sea Scroll project right from the beginning, thinks that Hebrew comes from Hapiru. Other scholars dispute that. They think it's a more generic term for nomadic, marauding, conquering peoples. But what is interesting is that the description of this particular nomadic people in what they do, in the cities that they conquer, precisely matches, in many ways, the activity of the Israelites as recorded in the book of Joshua and Judges. But in any case, this is very interesting. The basic picture we get from Canaanite records and their communications with the Egyptians is, hey, there's a conquering people group entering our land. And some of their actions match what we know from the biblical record. There's another very interesting extra-biblical reference to the nation of Israel. And this is specifically to the nation of Israel. It's called the Merneptah Stela, and it records an attack on areas in Canaan by Pharaoh Merneptah around 1209 BC is the accepted date. And it mentions Israel as part of the settled population of the land of Canaan. It mentions 3 cities, Ashkelon, which is a city known throughout Bible times, but all the way to the present, interestingly. It mentions Gezer and Yanoam. So 3 cities within the land. But it also mentions the people of Israel, and it implies that the people of Israel were the dominant group in the area. And the reason for that is in the inscription itself. And you can see it high on the board there. I guess I'll walk way back here and jump. Okay, this is the hieroglyph mentioning Israel. And this last determinative with these 3 little bars here refers to the people of Israel. That's the plural, okay? So you've got city names mentioned, but the people of Israel are mentioned. And in this stela, they're also mentioned as one of the 9 main enemies of the Egyptians. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's significant, I think, for dating the arrival of the Israelites into Canaan. First of all, we know they arrived. That's very important to establish that. But secondly, by 1209 BC, if they're listed as one of the main enemies of Egypt, the dominant people group in the area, then clearly they did not just arrive there carrying their tents. I mean, they've been established for a while, which implies an even earlier entrance into Canaan, which I think fits nicely with the basic chronology that the Bible lays out for Exodus and then conquest. So really no doubt about the establishment of the Israelite people in Canaan no later than the 13th century, maybe even earlier. And if the Hapiru are actually the Israelites, that would push it back well into the very beginning of the 14th century. Conforms very nicely to what you'd expect from the biblical record. Now, here's a really interesting thing. In addition to, we said basically, Israelites were Egypt, they got to Canaan, they started at time 1, they got there at time 2, but guess what? We even have evidence of them along the route. And this is actually a stunning find. It's an archaeological inscription mentioning Tashasu Yahweh, which means literally land of the nomads of Yahweh. This occurs on an Egyptian monument. It actually occurs several times on Egyptian monuments, but the earliest inscription is from right around the time of 1400 BC. And it describes them in the kind of general region of Moab and Edom. And if you look at the map, Moab and Edom are in that area to the east of the Jordan River and to the south, okay? So just right about where they'd be wandering near the end of their period of wandering. So highly significant finding to actually nail down their movements that precisely. But here's a big question. I want you to think about this. Why would the oldest mention of the God of the Hebrews be found on Egyptian monuments?
They were a large enough group to leave a mark.
They left a mark on the Egyptian mindset, didn't they? The Egyptians clearly knew who these people were. They were also clearly aware of their religious practices and their religious belief system. I mean, I think this is a pretty stunning find, okay? Because it clearly establishes the Egyptians had intimate knowledge of this people. Now, if they only arose, as the biblical minimalists say, kind of out of the hill country, kind of, emerged as a small little tribal group around 1000 BC, why are the Egyptians talking about them in 1400 BC? And talking about them specifically as nomads, and specifically about the name of their God? I think that's... I cannot square that piece of evidence with biblical minimalism. It comes too early, it's in the mouth of the Egyptians, it's got too much specificity of information about their movements. I think it's a stunning find. And I think it ought to, by itself, put to rest the whole school of biblical minimalism on this question of the Exodus. Here's one other thing. It's perhaps more speculative, but if you're mentioning some other people's God, perhaps you're mentioning them because you're aware of the power of that God. And there is actually an Egyptian document that records in poetic verse a series of events that sound very much like the plagues as recorded in the Bible. It's called the Ipawar Papyrus. It's a 13th century BC document. Notice some of the parallels in this document. It's kind of interesting. You have in the Ipawar Papyrus mentioning of the river is blood. The Exodus, of course, one of the plagues was the waters of the river were turned to blood. In the Ipawar Papyrus, there's mention that the grain has perished on every side. In the Exodus account, there's mention that the barley was smitten. In the Ipawar Papyrus, we're told that the land is without light. In the Exodus account, there is the thick darkness that God caused to fall upon the land. And finally, there is mention of the groaning throughout the land. In the Ipawar and in the Exodus account, the great cry. Okay, so this Ipawar Papyrus is a highly suggestive piece of evidence, but whether or not it is actually a record of the biblical plagues, I think there are some things that we can establish very definitively. In particular, we can establish that the Israelites were in Goshen, in Egypt, at point A, okay, at time 1, and time 1 being before the biblical date for the Exodus. Then at some time 2 later, about 1400 BC and after, they arrived at point B, in Canaan. So if they got from point A to point B, and they were once upon a time slaves in point A, they were clearly liberated, and they made an exodus, okay? So that's our conclusion, that the evidence indicates there was a migration of the Israelites from Egypt to Canaan about the middle of the 15th century BC, which is otherwise known as the Exodus.